This is the UC Center. This is the UC Sacramento Speaker Series. I'm Richard Kravitz, Director at UC Center Sacramento. And this is the 7th talk of the academic year, which continues on with our 2021 Speaker Series theme of emerging from the pandemic, promoting health and prosperity for all Californians in the wake of COVID-19. So today's topic is COVID-19 and school reopening, with particular attention to the effects on Black students. We know that COVID has not been good for K-12 education, and that the impacts have been particularly hard on students from racial and ethnic minority groups. That's why we're very pleased to have Dr. Stanley Johnson here to fill us in on how it's going for these students. And to introduce Dr. Johnson, we're very happy to have Dr. Joseph Bishop. Dr. Bishop is Director of the Center for Transformation of Schools in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. He's held a number of state and national educational leadership positions and was formerly a governor-appointed member of the California Post-Secondary Education Commission and served on the board of directors for the Center for Teacher Quality. Almost as important, he earned his doctorate in educational leadership, policy, and organizations from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he spent a summer interning with UC's Office of State Government Relations as a fellow with the nascent UC Center Sacramento many years ago. So before we bring Dr. Bishop up, just a reminder about the format for questions. Please raise your hand using the raise hand icon at the conclusion of the talk. Or if you're unable to do that, just enter your question into the Q&A feature on Zoom. So at this point, please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Bishop, who will introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Stanley Johnson. Dr. Bishop.
Thank you, Dr. Kravitz, and to the UC Center staff. Thank you for organizing this really important conversation. And although you heard the bio, I am now in a different role. It's a short day at school, and I'm picking up my son, so I apologize for being in the car. But our bios change depending on the moment, so always keep that in mind for our students. And I think so. Dr. Johnson, Dr. Stanley Lewis Johnson Jr., has been with our center for several years. Stan is an amazing educator and scholar. And we had the pleasure of writing 2 reports on Black student success and opportunity in LA County. And you're going to hear more from him momentarily. But just to share a little bit more about Stan, I'll say Stan for Dr. Johnson. So Stan earned his PhD from UCLA and his undergraduate degree from UCLA. So he's earned his PhD in the urban schooling program at UCLA. He earned his master's at LMU. He's taught in Compton. He's taught in Oakland. He is founding principal of the 100 Black Men Initiative, the Bay Area Community School in Oakland. Stan is passionate about English language arts, and he is currently leading our initiative in South Los Angeles to get more students of color into the STEM pipeline, leading a National Science Foundation research practice partnership. So Stan has worn many hats in the classroom, outside the classroom. He grew up in Pasadena, California. So when Stan talks about this research for Digging Deeper, it's not just data, it's lived experience. And I just have an incredible amount of respect for Stan and all that he's done. And he's taught me so much as a friend and colleague. And for our UC Center students and attendees today, I hope you'll take this work beyond the schoolhouse and think about statewide solutions, local city solutions, and county level, and even the role of the federal government. We know that no entity alone can take on issues of systemic inequality and racism alone. So Dr. Johnson, take it away.
Okay, thank you for that nice introduction, Joe, and Dr. Kravitz and the UC Center Sacramento. I'm very, very, very blessed to have the opportunity to be able to speak with you all today, and grateful for this opportunity. Essentially, my talk is titled "With Deliberate Intentions, COVID-19 and reopening schools for Black students, an in-depth exploration and discussion of the Beyond the Schoolhouse Digging Deeper, Prioritizing Black Student Wellness and Opportunity for Reopening Schools report, which we released in April of this year, April 2021. And as Joe mentioned, I am a researcher at the Center for the Transformation of School at UCLA. I just wanted to kind of underscore what we do and what drives our work. So before you, I'll read our mission. Our mission at the Center for the Transformation of School is dedicated to partnering with the education ecosystem to bring about systems change through humanizing research, validating practices, and transforming policies with key stakeholders to support equitable educational outcomes for historically underserved students. It is our vision to be a catalyst for learning communities to boldly nurture and protect the dignity, well-being, and full potential of all students. Second. And this slide here is essentially just to share with you all as well that we never do anything alone. I'm very fortunate to work with some exceptional colleagues, and they who also contributed to this particular report. While I was the lead author, I also want to give a shout out not only to Dr. Bishop, but to Dr. Tyrone Howard, who also is the faculty director of our center and a professor of education in the school and a professor of education here at UCLA. Dr. Angela James, who serves as a senior researcher in our center. Edwin Rivera, he's a research analyst and one of my co-conspirators with the work that we're also doing in terms of increasing the STEM pipeline in Los Angeles Unified School District. And our founding director of the Center for the Transformation of Schools, and now currently the dean at the University of Southern California, or that other school, as we like to say in the UC system, just across town, Dr. Pedro Noguera. Okay, and so before I actually move into the digging deeper aspect of our district level analysis, I think it is really important for you all to also have some additional context around our very first report. And the very onset of 2019, when I came on board to the Center for the Transformation of Schools, we were very much interested in thinking about creative ways for addressing issues that are impacting Black students in Los Angeles County. So the work actually began, I would say maybe 2017, with some of our graduate students who looked at the social, emotional health, and academic data from Black students here in the county. And our 2019 report that actually looked at what we refer to as this metaphor beyond the schoolhouse, these factors that contributed to whether or not students are going to experience positive outcomes in school. So the 2019 report was a county level analysis, and we looked at 14 schools that served a minimum of 800 or more Black students. And you can see those schools highlighted here in yellow. Some of the key findings from that report at the county level in terms of academic performance, Black students were performing at the lowest level on all standardized exams. They had the highest suspension rates. Their graduation rates were lower compared to their counterparts. And the A through G requirements were also in the lowest bands. In terms of our environmental and health data that we looked at, it was clear to us that many of the students in the county were facing multiple adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And that is to say that they were beset with traumas that impact their overall performance in terms of when they enter into school. Some of this, we saw issues of families not being nuclear. There were issues of more prone to live in families with food insecurities. Some of the neighborhoods that they were living in had no green spaces and were beset with food deserts. And it's extremely important to think about those things in terms of thinking about creative solutions to address the problem. And finally, Black students not only in the 14 districts that we highlight, but several throughout the county have some of the low human development numbers. So our final recommendations that we were thinking about in terms of just cohesively for this talk in terms of thinking of moving to looking at a district level analysis is that place matters. And that is to say, where one lives determines the quality of the education with which they will receive. And one of our many recommendations was really to think about how do we mitigate the accumulation of disadvantage that Black students are dealing with, precisely because districts lack the resources to address the social, emotional, health, and behavioral needs of students, which contributes to challenges and creates barriers to learning. So as we move forward throughout this talk, when I allude to beyond the schoolhouse, consider it a metaphor in terms of making sense and framing things to help you understand our findings a little bit more clearer. And so in front of you here, you see where in Los Angeles County, there are approximately 109,000 Black students. So the slide pretty much speaks for itself. Whereas if the 109,000 Black students in LA County were in a single school district, it would be the third largest school district in the state of California and the 26th largest in the nation. And I think what I also would like to underscore is that the 14 school districts that I alluded to earlier, 2/3 of all Black students in the county attend schools in these particular districts. Now, in terms of as we move from the county level analysis, our Beyond the Schoolhouse Digging Deeper report that was released in April of this year wanted to narrow down the focus. Instead of looking at things from a more macro county level, we are honing in on these 14 school districts. So I think it would be important that in order to understand our key findings, it would be important to keep in mind that there are two major factors that must be considered when examining African-American students in LA County. These factors are economic inequality and decline in enrollment. With respect to economic inequality, for example, poverty is a major issue facing many Black students and their families. For example, in 10 out of the 14 focus districts, Black students and families, along with other non-Black groups that are living in these communities, many are living 2 times below the federal poverty line and are faced with significant housing and stability challenges. In terms of declining enrollment, over the last 2 decades, many Blacks have moved away from LA into different parts of the county, and notably Antelope Valley, which is the northern part of the county. I think this is important for you all to keep in mind and to consider, primarily because when we think and take into consideration the impact of issues of race, class, and implicit bias, that's very important in terms of when we think about the context of students teaching and learning. In our report overall, you'll see that the overall decline is not consistent across all of the focus districts. And this is just a visual representation to kind of underscore and see the declining enrollment over the last 20 years. That literally has been about 42%. Where, again, visually, I think it's important for our visual learners to have a better context of the narrative. Similarly, we have an interactive district map that highlights all of our findings and will allow you to kind of navigate and click on certain indicators to provide a much more in-depth information about the data and provide a better, or I would say a clearer picture of that particular group and those discursive communities. And it will be important as I move forward in this presentation, especially when I talk about the next key findings. So I'd like to now draw your attention to our health neighborhood findings. This first, the first finding in terms of our health and neighborhood conditions is important primarily because as we consider factors that may impact learning beyond the schoolhouse, We examined health and environmental indicators for each of the 14 districts. Public health research suggests that the burdens of pollution, disease, and illness are unevenly distributed across race and geography. Inequalities relating to these burdens may directly affect academic outcomes by virtue of their impact on absences and instructional time. And that's going to be important as you think about the ways with which we kind of pathologize students of color, particularly Black students, when it comes to issues of chronic absenteeism. Typically, one tends to focus or look at it from a deficit perspective, i.e. truancy, when in fact, there could be other factors that may contribute to why a student may not be attending schools. And we felt that it was important to highlight that. However, where there is residential distinctiveness, there are striking differences in the burdens of pollution and poor health. One of the first major health findings is groundwater pollution and its impact on Black students and their families. For example, Black families reside in census tracts with the highest levels of groundwater pollution, while white families in those same districts generally live in areas with the lowest levels of groundwater threats. Similarly, Black families tend to reside in parts of the county with higher lead exposure rates, greater proximity to waste dump sites, higher concentrations of air pollution from surrounding oil production, and in close proximity to high density transportation arteries. These environmental factors are linked directly to asthma and other chronic respiratory illnesses and low birth weights. With respect to respiratory illnesses in Los Angeles Unified, Long Beach Unified, and Antelope Valley, as you can see in front of you, census tracts containing the highest proportions of Black are also those in the 90th percentile or above for respiratory related emergency room visits. In these school districts, chronic absenteeism and dropout rates are notably higher. And finally, Black student populations in certain districts are concentrated in census tracts that have among the highest rates of low birth weight births in the state. So in tandem, groundwater threats, acute respiratory illnesses, emergency room visits due to asthma or respiratory distress, and low birth weight all suggest Black students in some districts in LA County face unique circumstances. And so to provide a little bit of context for individuals who may not be aware of some of these particular aspects of groundwater threats and terms that I'm speaking about, what I'm referring to is in the state, there's the presence of aging storage containers that pose a threat to contaminating drinking water. Residential concentrations of Black in LAUSD, Torrance Unified School District are in census tracts with among the highest numbers of these threats. Other indicators of the disparate environmental and health context relate to our pollution and air quality findings regarding acute respiratory illnesses. And we saw this more pervasive in LAUSD, Long Beach, and Antelope Valley Union, as well as low birth weight, particularly in Los Angeles Unified and Antelope Valley in some of the respective highlighted districts. I would also like to encourage you to look at our interactive map when you have a moment where you can find much more specific and detailed information with respect to this finding. In terms of our academic data findings, there are a range of indicators that one uses when analyzing student achievement and academic outcomes, which many of you may be familiar with. But generally speaking, academic outcomes are measured around student performance on standardized assessments, which is a smarter balance assessment or Common Core state standards, whether they graduate from high school in 4 years, and to what extent they meet requirements that make them eligible to apply for admissions into a California State University or University of California institution of higher learning. In examining each of these areas, for example, in addition to needing targeted support in English language arts, almost 50% of Black 8th grade students are also not meeting grade level standards for mathematics in 12 of the 14 focus districts. With respect to graduation rates, Black students in 12 of the 14 districts have graduation rates that meet or exceed the county and state averages, which is quite promising. Finally, Black students' A through G requirements are lower than county and state averages. In examining all of these indicators, the data reveals that Black students are behind their counterparts and they are in need of targeted support that must be deliberate and intentional in order to close these gaps as we move toward fully reopening schools. Excuse me. This next slide depicts our school climate and policing findings. So school climate, right, is an idea about how connected, safe, and engaged students in the entire school community feel. Indicators used to indicate a less healthy school environment include suspensions and chronic absences, particularly when they are disproportionate. Both are thought to reflect student connection and the strength of relationships within schools. These outcomes also reflect lost instructional time that may negatively impact learning. Chronic absenteeism, for example, among Black students is much higher in some districts than others. And we noticed this in our data. Antelope Valley Union, Los Angeles Unified School District, and Centinela Valley Union of the 14 had extreme high rates of chronic absenteeism. So disproportionate out-of-school suspensions is a persistent social justice issue that has been connected to both social pathologizing and policing of Black youth. For that reason, I want to draw attention to our findings regarding higher suspension rates for Black students in general, and in particular for Black students with disabilities. In terms of policing, right? Well, in our country, we see that it is a huge social justice issue, and is certainly among the issues of our time. While this study did not examine the issue in depth, we show that investment in various forms of policing in districts in Los Angeles County is substantial. It is noticeable that Los Angeles Unified School District has the largest school police force in the country and the world, underscoring the need to empirically assess the impact of police on school climate broadly, and specifically on the safety, well-being, and sense of connectedness for our Black students. And I would like to personally give a shout out to our colleague and co-author, Dr. Angela James, who spent a significant time helping us to run analysis to be able to come up with these findings in this area, to think about ways that we can begin to address and reverse the pathology that is unfairly placed onto Black students. And our final key finding in terms of special populations is that we conclude by examining a subgroup of Black students. Our findings for special populations of students are inextricably tied to the underlying factor of concentrated poverty. Our most vulnerable, and I put that in quote, Black students who are economically disadvantaged, navigating the foster care system, and those who are experiencing homelessness are significantly and disproportionately impacted from poverty compared to white students. As mentioned earlier, Black students in 10 of the 14 districts are in households that are 2 times below the poverty line. In 12 of the 14 districts, Black students in foster care have chronic absenteeism rates of 20% or higher. And in 8 of the 14 districts, Black students are twice as likely to experience homelessness than other racial and ethnic groups. Black students are twice as likely to experience homelessness. And for that reason, I would say it's important for me to emphasize again, given the impact of poverty, it is now more evident than ever that these vulnerable student population groups will need targeted support, services, and fiscal resources that must be deliberate and intentional in order to close these gaps as we move toward reopening schools with an unapologetic commitment to equitable policies that prioritize the educational, health, and social and emotional needs of all students, but particularly Black students. I'm almost at the end of the presentation, but I think it would be important to talk about the specific recommendations that we actually have here. So we offer a series of cross-cutting recommendations for policymakers at the city, district, county, state, and federal level, literally all levels here, that explicitly addresses our findings with respect to COVID-19 and reopening schools and what should be prioritized for both in and out of school policies. I think if you can pay close attention to the state in terms of implicating the state for me, it's important that we need to be specific that there is a dedicated amount of funds given to districts to augment the local control funding formula, which is our policy here in California, and requiring a clear articulation of evidence-based practices to support student learning and growth for Black students. In terms of a policy that we look even at the highest level as we share, Dr. Bishop did a really great job helping us to synthesize how we can think about ways for the federal government to be deliberate. And I do know that President Biden's American Rescue Plan, that there are allocated funds that are there. And so for us, we believe that counties and districts should be able to use monies to focus on explicitly addressing opportunity gaps, including the digital divide and student achievement differences for Black youth. And in terms of our in-school policies, there must be a deliberate and intentional focus on essential academic skills and competencies across subject. Listed are some of the ways we enthusiastically believe how this can be effective. And again, once again, I think research has shown that strengthening the pipeline for more Black teachers to become educators, a factor which has been shown significantly to improve achievement and college matriculation rates. That's something that I believe should be at the forefront of any policymaker to get Black teachers and other teachers of color in front of Black students who can not only identify with them, but help to mitigate some of the issues that they are dealing and facing with in their communities, as well as providing high expectations for them academically. I definitely know that that is something that is not only critical, but is effective. And then two, at the federal government level, increase Title I funding that encourage school systems to use federal funds to invest in Black students and their learning. See, lastly, there must also be a concentrated focus for healthier schools and positive learning environments for Black students. I fundamentally believe that if we do not prioritize this, it not only will it continue to keep the current achievement gap that we actually have, but it's going to set many of our students and their families to be structurally disenfranchised. Sure. And for our out of school policies, which are also listed here, priorities must be centered on addressing students and families' basic needs. And so again, with respect to poverty, which is just a huge issue, not only here in the United States, but just in our world, I definitely know that just to be able to meet Black students and their families where they are financially can be something that we have the resources to do. It's something that should definitely be prioritized. Specifically in the state of California, I'd like to draw your attention to that particular finding recommendation where, for us, encouraging partnerships between education, housing, and child welfare stakeholders, and dedicate state community schools grants to Black communities, as well as the federal government prioritizing federal housing vouchers, food stamps, cash grants, Medicaid, and tax credits, which have all been shown historically to boost learning and financially struggling families. Let's see, this may be my last slide. And the final one has a lot to do with our finding where in Black women health, particularly with respect to low birth weight. I think for us also too, it was important that we make the recommendation that there must be a strategically comprehensive and meticulous approach when addressing the maternal and infant health needs of Black women and their children. Right around the time when we released this report, the Centers for Disease Control was very, very, very blatant in sharing that racism is a public health problem. And that has been something that has been contributing to issues impacting Black people in this country, particularly Black women. And I think having ways to mitigate that and to address and give resources in this particular area will be extremely helpful in the future to mitigate that particular alarming finding. So, one second. And this last slide is really more me. I'm Stanley Johnson. As Dr. Bishop talked about like earlier, I think it's very important for us to even now begin to look at policies and budgets that we have here with our local control funding formula. And I wanted to offer a few insights after having read meticulously Governor Newsom's new budget, which is loosely touted as his comeback plan. First and foremost, I think that there are a lot of positive things that are in the budget, which essentially it shows that this is the highest level of state school funding in history, which is an equity victory with respect to strategically targeting and investing in our most vulnerable populations. I think also too, strangely, the priorities that are articulated there also aligns almost identically with the cross-cutting recommendations that we have made with respect to both in-school and out-of-school policies. Where I have some reservation and gives me a lot of pause has a lot to do with interrogating the language that's in our local control funding formula. So, and while the local control funding formula is essentially doing its job to address all students, I want to stress the critical importance of the language within the policy that is problematic and one that needs to be addressed. Failure to do this will continue to lump all Black children into this pool versus explicitly using the term Black or African American so that these students are eligible to receive additional targeted supports and services. The data clearly shows that Black children are performing in the lowest tiers, yet there isn't a deliberate focus explicitly addressing this equity issue, which is a civil rights problem and issue for me of our time. If we are to reimagine better outcomes for our most vulnerable Black students in the state and the country, I would even go so far as to suggest that the federal government creates a new title that explicitly addresses the needs of subgroups of Black children in the same ways that Title III supports English language learners. These same groups receive targeted fiscal resources and support monies from both Title I, Title II, and the school's general fund, which, it seems to me, is responsible for developing caste systems within schools that, by default, harms a subgroups of Black children even more compared to their other vulnerable counterparts. And for me, the language, again, vulnerable, is problematic primarily because you're lumping all the students who are having issues or not meeting academic standards into one area when it should be disaggregated much more clearly and specific, and policy can be driven in a way that is aligned based on the information that can be specific to Black students in this particular context. So for federal and state level policymakers, I think it would be important to develop policy informed by accurate data on Black students, which will provide a more complete picture and around sound data that can be used to address the issues. And so as I begin to close, I felt that this quote, by Brian Stevenson was extremely powerful, and it synthesizes and kind of closes my talk. And he shares, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. So in closing, on behalf of my co-authors and colleagues at the Center for the Transformation of Schools, I would like to take this opportunity to thank UC Center Sacramento for allowing me to share our report's findings and recommendations. I would also encourage you to visit our website, review the interactive map and full reports referenced in today's presentation, and also learn more about the various kinds of research endeavors we prioritize that centered around issues of equity and social justice. I look forward to engaging in any questions that you may have, both now and in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for such a fantastic talk today. I'm just going to give Brooke just a sec here so she can go ahead and stop our recording.